Hello, it's Deborah Richards from Madison's Residential and welcome to my latest video news. Well, we're drawing to the end of 2022, so I thought it might be quite useful to give you a general roundup of what this year has looked like and what I think might happen next year. Well, of course, as we came into the beginning of 2022, the markets were still absolutely booming. They were still going crazy. Buyer demand was through the roof. Zoopla estimated there was a 60% increase on usual buyer demand. So quite simply, too many buyers chasing too few properties. And as a result of that, as you can imagine, prices were increasing. So the annual price growth up to the end of January 2022 was 7.8%, so almost 8% in a year. You combine that with what happened during the pandemic, we were seeing growth of around 15% over those last 2 years. Of course, the pandemic had reintroduced this valuation of home and the fight for space. So many people feeling, I don't need to live so close to where I work. I can move out to other areas, get more bang for my buck in terms of money and value of property, and have a nicer lifestyle. So this enormous demand surging through that was still going crazy at the beginning of 2022. And of course, in the spring of 2022, we came fully out of COVID, really. I mean, most restrictions in the UK completely lifted. Even travel became a lot easier. I remember skiing in February, still had to do a passenger locator form, but that then went soon after. So yeah, everything easing, everything having a sense of getting back to a new normal, and that demand still raging. But of course, there were some headwinds. I reported on them at the end of last year. I did say this year would have some headwinds, and that mainly was all around inflation. So inflation absolutely starting to pick up. Inflation normally sits around 2%, and there was a fear that with the amount of money that had been pushed into the economy through the pandemic, through all the furlough scheme, the bounce back loans, and people not being able to spend their money, there was this big surplus of money building up in people's bank accounts. 150 billion pounds they think was in people's bank accounts at the end of the third lockdown. What excess, wow. So basically this money starting to need to be spent, therefore too much money chasing too few goods, and was what always happens, you start to get prices rising. Again, supply and demand, not enough goods to go around, lots of money chasing it, prices rise. So inflation always looking like a worry. What I wasn't predicting back when I looked at 2022 was the war in Ukraine. That came out of nowhere. I remember February 24th, my wedding anniversary, and hearing that Russia had invaded Ukraine, and just couldn't believe it. And of course, that has compounded inflation. That has made it worse. So you then have even less goods coming to market because although Ukraine wasn't a huge supplier to us here in the UK, they supplied lots of other parts of the world, and therefore they were less able to supply us. So about 4% of inflation down to Ukraine, about 6% down to what had happened through the pandemic. So inflation sitting at around 10%. And of course that had to be controlled. So one of the easiest ways to control inflation is simply to raise interest rates. If you make debt more expensive, people have less money in their pockets, can't spend as much. So bank base rates started to tip up. It sat at 0.1% back at the end of 2021. January went to 0.25, and then we saw a range of rises, some big rises in there as well, 0.5%, 0.75%, until we end up now with base rate at 3%. And of course, one of the reasons Bank of England had to aggressively rise base rate was because of that disastrous mini budget. So I would say the market coming up to through the summer, it was starting to slow a little bit. There was definitely a slight easing as mortgage rates were becoming a little bit more expensive. But as ever, it takes time for people to realise what's going on. So it was definitely easing a little bit. We were finding it was a little bit more price sensitive. You couldn't just go to market with those huge prices, but generally was okay. And then the Queen died at the beginning of September. And that certainly sent a massive shock through the country, really. And I think it felt like bad form to view a property during that time. So September would normally be a really strong start to the autumn market. We would start to really feel a ramp up of activity as the schools go back. And that just never really happened because of the Queen dying. And then, of course, on the 23rd of September, Liz Truss delivered her disastrous mini budget, which was a nightmare for the global markets. I think it was seen that inflation was an issue and the Bank of England were trying to control that with rising interest rates. And Liz Truss then came out and put her foot hard on the accelerator and introduced a wealth of tax cuts, which completely opposed what the Bank of England were doing. Basically, if you have tax cuts, you have more money in your pocket, you can spend more. So Bank of England trying to control spending, Liz Truss trying to raise spending, and the global markets just thought we'd gone mad, really, bonkers, that the lunatics were running the asylum. So that was why Bank of England came out so aggressively and said that they would rise rates to control the markets and inflation. And of course, during all of that, the banks, they basically dictate their mortgage rates by looking at what's called the 5-year or the 2-year swap rate, which is basically the rate they can borrow money from other banks at, and they fix in at a certain rate. And 5-year swap rates got pulled by a variety of banks. So that was when we got all those negative headlines in the press saying about banks pulling rates. They weren't pulling any mortgage offers for people who already had a piece of paper or had exchanged. They were just unable to call what the 5-year rate was. So they over-exaggerated it, went to above 6% to kind of think, well, it's worst case scenario, and many pulled rates entirely. Liz Truss then left, Rishi Sunak in, Bank of England raised rates, have said they are not going to raise them as much now because the economy is feeling much more stable and we have a reducing mortgage rate environment. So where are we now? Well, the autumn market has been incredibly lacklustre and disappointing, there's no doubt about it. We simply haven't had the usual volume of activity that we would expect to have. Excuse me, I'm full of cold, as you can hear. But looking forward, I think we'll still see a good number of transactions next year, and that's because we don't live in an environment that relies on high mortgages. That's a phenomenon that's being underreported in the press. How many people are sitting on cash or have good equity and can easily afford their mortgage payments? They will still need to move for a variety of reasons: births, deaths, hatches, matches, dispatches, what they call it. Excuse me. And those people with those low mortgages will be able to take advantage of a slightly cooling price environment. So prices will either stabilise or drop up to 5% next year, not sure, but I think that will be a short-term phenomena. And as I always say, anybody who doesn't need to sell and isn't forced to sell will simply ride out this negative market. And therefore, with less stock coming to market, less supply, demand simply will be able to meet that. Less demand, less supply, prices, I think, should hold in our area. We're so lucky to live in such a lovely area with great schooling, great transport links, beautiful architecture, green spaces. And so Tunbridge Wells does sit in a bit of a bubble. But it'll be interesting to see, and I look forward to bringing you all the updates next year as they arise.